Temporary duty assignments can sometimes bring a bit of excitement, but this one was far from it. It was a grueling 30 days of nearly non-stop work. Each year, the U.S. Army participates in a rapid deployment exercise where select units are flown, along with all their gear, to Germany to train for a month with NATO forces. I'm Mark Benson, and at that time, I was a relatively new captain stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, working in the operations division. The timing of this deployment couldn't have been worse. My wife, Rachel, was pregnant and expected to deliver sometime during my time away. We'd been married for almost 6 years, but things had been strained. When the deployment started, my commanding officer assured me, "Mark, I'll do everything I can to get you home before the baby arrives." He really meant it, and when the exercise ended, I packed my things, ready to head back. Before boarding the plane, I called Rachel. She told me she thought she'd be hospitalized soon. "Sounds like my timing is perfect." "I'm on my way home," I reassured her. But things took a turn. It was getting dark as I was headed to the airport when a deer darted into the road. My driver swerved, and the next thing I remember was waking up in a military hospital in Frankfurt. My right side was a mess: broken arm, leg, ribs, and a collapsed lung. "How long have I been here?" I asked the nurse. 5 days, she said. My heart sank. "Is my wife here?" "No, sir," she replied. I called Rachel. Her first words were, "Are you okay?" I could tell something was off. "Don't worry about me," I said. "How are you? And the baby?" Then she broke down. "We lost the baby, Mark. I'm so sorry." My head spun, and all I could ask was, "Are you okay?" She choked out, "Physically, I'm fine, but emotionally, I'm a wreck." 2 weeks later, I was flown home in a medevac plane. Rachel met me and stayed with me as I was admitted to the hospital at Fort Hood. She was still a mess emotionally, but we leaned on each other. My stay in the hospital lasted another 2 weeks before I was sent home on limited duty. 2 years passed after we lost the baby, and I was transferred to Heidelberg, Germany. We spent the next 3 years traveling across Europe. I was promoted to major, and then we were transferred again, this time to Fort Lewis, Washington. As a major, we got nicer housing than we'd had before, complete with garages instead of carports. When we moved into our house at Fort Lewis, all the stuff we had taken with us to Germany was shipped back. We also unpacked boxes we hadn't taken overseas. As I sliced open one of those old boxes with a box cutter, something caught my eye. A small wooden box I didn't remember packing. I pulled it out, placed it on top of the stack of boxes, and opened it. That moment changed my life. Inside, there was a small stack of envelopes tied with a pink ribbon. I untied it, grabbed the first envelope, and opened it. Inside was a birth certificate. My mind clouded over as I read the details. A baby girl, 7 pounds, 6 ounces, and 19 inches long, born alive on the very date Rachel had told me our baby didn't survive. Her name was Grace. The mother's name was listed as Rachel Jane Benson, but where the father's name should have been, it simply said, "Unknown." I grabbed the next envelope, and it only got worse. It was an adoption certificate. I read it over and over, unable to believe it. Our daughter, Grace, had been given up for adoption, and Rachel had signed away all parental rights. It stated that since the father's identity was unknown, his permission wasn't needed. How many men had she been with? Did she even know? I was furious. I couldn't stand being in the house, so I drove to the golf course. I sat down at the 19th hole, ordered 2 eggs and corned beef hash, my old favorite breakfast before Rachel started controlling what I ate, and forced most of it down. I sat on the deck, watching the golfers finish their rounds, trying to clear my head. When I got home later, Rachel had made good progress unpacking boxes and organizing the house. I went to the office, but I couldn't focus. My mind was elsewhere. I didn't head back home until after midnight. When I got there, Rachel was lying in bed reading. I undressed, took a shower, and as I walked out, I said, "I'll sleep downstairs." I didn't want to be near her. I had just settled on the couch, turned on the TV, when she came in. She grabbed the remote, turned off the TV, and stared me down. "Cut the crap. Tell me what's wrong, and I'll either help or leave." "Which is it?" "I haven't done anything wrong, so I won't sit here and let you act like I'm the bad guy," she snapped. I walked over, calmly took the remote back, turned the TV on again, and said, "Have a nice trip." She left within the hour. The next Monday, I went to my commander and told him everything. I even showed him the documents. He looked as stunned as I felt. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Did she say where she was going when she left?" He continued, "No, sir, but she didn't take all her things, especially that box." I paused, trying to process everything before speaking again. I was starting to think about the next steps. If this girl, Grace, was really my daughter, I had to know for sure, but finding her would be nearly impossible. Adoption cases are airtight, my commander said when I mentioned it to him. Confidentiality is paramount for both sides. "I get that," I said, "but I can't just sit here. I need to start somewhere because I sure as hell don't trust Rachel to give me the truth anymore." Then it hit me like a bolt of lightning. "Wait, I have an idea. Can I take the rest of the day off?" "Go ahead," he replied, probably wondering what had just happened. I saluted, bolted out of his office, and headed straight to my car. I raced home and grabbed the wooden box again. I tipped it over, spilling the contents onto the floor. There, among the other items, was a pacifier. A pacifier? This had to have been Grace's before Rachel gave her up. I sealed it in a clear plastic bag and then searched the bathroom for any trace of Rachel. Her things were mostly gone, but I found her old hairbrush under the sink. I bagged that too, tossed both bags in the car, and sped off to a DNA lab in downtown Seattle. When I got to the lab, the woman at the front desk told me it'd take about 3 weeks. That seemed like an eternity, but I had no choice. The next day, I got a call from Rachel, her tone colder than ice. "Hey, are you feeling better?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "Better than what?" she shot back. "Better than the idiot you were a couple days ago?" "No, same idiot." Her words didn't surprise me anymore. 3 weeks, I said, keeping my voice steady. "By then, I'll know whether I'm just divorcing you or something else." She paused for a moment, then hung up. I ignored her when she called back immediately. When I got home that day, Rachel was waiting for me in the driveway. She was livid. "What do you mean you're going to either liquidate me or divorce me?" she barked. "Exactly what I said," I replied flatly. "I deserve an explanation," she demanded. "Me too," I shot back. "What do you think I'm talking about?" Her face twisted in confusion. "I don't know what you mean. I've done nothing wrong." That's when it finally seemed to hit her. "Oh my God, no. Please, no." "I'll be back in an hour," I said firmly. "You better not be here when I return. I leave for work at 6:30 in the morning. Be gone by the time I get home at 5. I left and came back an hour later, and just as I expected, she was gone. So was the box and a lot of her things. When I walked in that evening, the house felt empty. Almost all the furniture was gone, too. She left a couple of things, though, like my favorite chair and the guest bedroom set. How kind of her. The next morning, I called into work to let them know I'd be late. Then I started making calls, to the housing office to arrange temporary furniture, to the credit union, the stockbroker, the insurance company. I wanted to get all those mundane tasks out of the way that come with a divorce. I also made an appointment with Jack. I knew they couldn't represent me in civilian court, but I figured they could offer some advice. They confirmed what I had feared. She'd get half. We didn't own a house since we lived in government housing, but we had enough saved up to buy one if we wanted. Both cars were paid off too, which didn't make things any easier to stomach. For the next few weeks, life continued like nothing had changed. I went to work, did the chores around the house, mowed the lawn, washed the car, just trying to keep busy. One morning, the phone rang. "Hello? Is this Major Mark Benson?" the woman on the line asked. "Yes, it is. This is Diane from the DNA Analysis Center. A few weeks ago, you gave us some samples to test." "Yes, I did. Do you have the results?" "We do, but I can't give them to you over the phone. You can come in, or we can mail them to you since we've already verified your ID when you came in before." "I'll come in," I said. I wasn't waiting another minute longer than I had to. I walked through the lab doors and asked for Diane. She came out, and after checking my ID again, she led me into a small room. After a few moments, she returned with the results. She handed me the pacifier and explained, "Sample A is yours. Sample B is from the hairbrush, and sample C is from the pacifier. We were able to confirm that B and C are related. Sample A, however, is not related to either. I nodded, numb. Thank you, I said as I pocketed the pacifier and took the papers. At least I didn't have a daughter calling another man daddy, but someone else did. I left the lab and got in touch with a few attorneys. JAG couldn't recommend specific lawyers, but they gave me a list of approved firms. After making several appointments, I found my guy, a retired JAG officer who had a deep hatred for cheating spouses, whether it was the wife or the husband doing the cheating. I spent over an hour in his office, telling him everything. When I got home that evening, there was a letter waiting for me. It was from Rachel. The letter was short, almost dismissive. Mark, 3 weeks are up. Rachel. The return address was her parents' house in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. I called her. Hi, Mark. She answered like nothing had happened. I'm not talking about this over the phone, and I'm definitely not flying to Pennsylvania to discuss it, I told her. Well, I'm already in Seattle. I sent that letter last week when I was there. Fine. I'll be at the house at 6:30 tomorrow. Be there, I told her and hung up the phone. I didn't prepare anything special for Rachel's visit. No drinks, no snacks, nothing. This was strictly business. I placed the DNA results and my copies of the birth certificate and adoption papers on the cheap, government-issued coffee table. She pulled into the driveway at 6:20, but waited until exactly 6:30 to ring the doorbell. I took my time answering the door, no rush on my part. When I finally opened it, I gestured for her to come in and pointed to where she should sit. I sat on the couch, and she settled in the stiff, uncomfortable chair across from me. Without a word, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the pacifier, holding it out to her. She snatched it up like it was a lifeline, clutching it to her chest. Thank you, she said, like I'd handed her a winning lottery ticket. I followed up by handing her the DNA test results. You already know I'm not the father, but this will make it official. She took the paper with her left hand, still gripping the pacifier in her right. Your sample A? She asked. Yeah, I replied. I pushed the rest of the documents across the table toward her without saying anything else. She leaned forward and saw the title of the top sheet. As she skimmed it, tears started welling up in her eyes. She set the DNA results aside and picked up the divorce papers, but the tears were already falling onto the form, making the ink blur. She dropped the papers, her hand trembling. Can I have a tissue? She asked, her voice shaky. I don't have any, I said coldly. You're not making this easy, are you? She muttered, wiping her face with her sleeve. You cheated, I stated flatly. She nodded, eyes downcast. How many times? I asked. Does it really matter? She shot back. No, I admitted. I just want to know. One weekend. A few different men. It only happened once, she confessed. Who was he? I pressed, even though deep down, I didn't care anymore. Actually, does it even matter? I just want to know. I think I deserve that. I'm not telling you, she said firmly. Do I know him? I'm not telling you, she repeated. So, you'd rather protect him than try to save your marriage? I asked, incredulous. She picked up the divorce petition. Our marriage is dead anyway. Why destroy it even more? Fine, I said. But you owe me an explanation for why you lied about our daughter being stillborn. She sighed deeply, clearly gearing up for a long confession. When I found out I was pregnant, I wasn't sure if the baby was yours or his. I thought about terminating the pregnancy, but I couldn't go through with it. As time went on, I tried to convince myself that you'd never know for sure. When we learned it was a girl, I got even more nervous. There's always a special bond between a father and daughter, and I knew you'd fall in love with her. But I was terrified you might see the truth, that she wasn't yours. Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. When you went on your deployment, my nerves calmed a bit. I was relieved that you wouldn't be around when she was born. Then you told me you were coming home early, and the panic set in again. It was a roller coaster. Maybe you'd be there. Maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you'd know, maybe not. She paused, her face crumpling under the weight of the memory. She was born alive, and she was perfect. They placed her on my chest, and I fell in love instantly. She had blonde hair and blue eyes, just like her father's. She stopped, her eyes locking with mine. You have brown hair and brown eyes. No one in either of our families has blonde hair or blue eyes. I knew she wasn't yours. But I loved you. I loved her too. But I knew I had to choose. And I chose you. Her hands trembled as she continued. The hospital staff helped me when I told them I wanted to give her up for adoption. Within 24 hours, the paperwork was done. They asked me who the father was, and I told them I didn't know. They said it would be easier that way. If I'd given a name, they'd need his permission to give her up. Her eyes drifted to the pacifier in her hand. I breastfed her, held her. She was sucking on this pacifier when they brought me the papers to sign. I knew I had to tell you something, so I lied. I told you she didn't make it, that her remains were cremated. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a strange mix of regret and disbelief. I can't believe you never asked to see a birth certificate, a death certificate, anything. I trusted you, I said quietly, the words heavier than I intended. Why wouldn't I? Besides, the whole thing was so traumatic. I didn't see the point in dragging it out any further. Looking at those papers would have just added to our pain. She nodded, sniffling. After that, we went back to our lives, like nothing had happened. I was almost happy, but a part of me has been missing ever since. It gets harder every year, especially around her birthday. Every year, I take out her birth certificate, touch her little footprints, and hold this pacifier. Her voice cracked again. There were times I wanted to put it in my mouth, just to feel closer to her. But it still had my breast milk on it, and I wanted to keep it intact, so I never did. She gasped suddenly. Oh my God, it's gone. She looked at me, wide-eyed. It's gone. My milk, you took it. You let the DNA lab scrape it off. It's gone, you idiot. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing, curling into a ball. I couldn't just leave her like that, so I picked her up and put her on the couch, covering her with a blanket. I couldn't bear to be around her anymore, so I left the room and went upstairs. I didn't go to bed, though. I couldn't sleep. Hours later, around midnight, I heard the toilet flush. I went downstairs, and there she was, sitting on the couch. Do you want some coffee? I asked, more out of habit than anything. Yes, please, she said, her voice hoarse from crying. She sat at the counter while I brewed a cup. She took a sip. I guess I got cold feet, huh? Something like that, I said, neither of us making eye contact. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, sipping our coffee. More? I asked, standing to refill my cup. Yes, please, she answered softly. Where are you staying? I asked, brewing more coffee. At a motel, she said. I was with my parents most of the time, though. You were there for more than 3 weeks? No, just a few days with them. They paid for me to visit, but I lied to them too. Told them we were going through a rough patch, and I needed to get away for a while. I didn't say anything. There wasn't much left to say. They think I came back to help fix things between us, Rachel said, her voice flat as she glanced around the room. Without another word, she walked over to the coffee table, pulled a pin from her purse, and sat down. Without even glancing at the documents, she signed the divorce papers and left, shutting the door behind her like it was just another day. When I woke up the next morning, it was already Sunday. I spent the rest of the day thinking, replaying everything in my head. On Monday, I took the signed papers to my attorney, who filed them without hesitation. But my mind kept drifting back to the same question. Who was the guy Rachel cheated with? She never gave me a name, and it wasn't just the cheating that ate away at me. It was how she defended him. She wouldn't tell me who he was, protecting him like he was some kind of saint. All she said was it was a one-weekend thing. But it didn't make the anger any less bitter. Work helped, though. I was so busy that I didn't have much time to dwell on it. 2 weeks later, I was back at Fort Hood for a military seminar. This one was a bit more laid-back than usual, nothing too intense. We were split into groups of 3 for a project, and, wouldn't you know it, I got paired with a major from Alaska named Eric Thompson. He was stationed at Fort Wainwright, the coldest base in the U.S. Army, but he loved it there. Eric was a natural when it came to computers, a real genius. We hit it off right away, like we'd been friends forever. By the end of the first week, we were ahead of everyone else, so we took it easy. On Friday, we had lunch at the officers' club. He started talking about his personal life, how he cheated on his wife, and now his kids were calling some other guy dad. I could tell it still stung, even though he tried to play it off. When he was done, I laid my story on him. I didn't hold back. When I finished, Eric had a strange look in his eyes. "And you still don't know who she had the affair with?" he asked, leaning in. "Nope. She wouldn't tell me. It happened here, at Hood, almost 6 years ago. All she told me was that he had blonde hair and blue eyes." Eric stared at me for a moment, then said, "Come with me." Curious, I followed him to the Manpower Center. Everyone who comes through Fort Hood has to check in there, so it seemed like a good place to start. We went straight to the HR director's office. She was a woman in her 60s with a twinkle in her eye, and as soon as she saw Eric, she lit up. "Aunt Clara." Eric greeted her, pulling her into a hug. She turned to me with a warm smile. "Hi, Mark," she said, extending her hand. Mrs. James?" I started, seeing her nameplate on the desk. "Call me Aunt Clara." "Everyone does," she said with a laugh. Eric got straight to the point. "Aunt Clara, do you remember any fair-haired, blue-eyed officers who were here about 6 years ago?" She paused, thinking. No one comes to mind right away. But that doesn't mean much. Not everyone comes through my office personally." Then she turned to me. "Mark Benson, right? You were stationed here around that time, weren't you?" I was stunned she remembered my name. "Yes, ma'am, I was." Eric chuckled at my surprise. "Aunt Clara has Sam. She remembers just about anything she's ever read, seen, or been involved with. It's called superior autobiographical memory. Or a curse," Aunt Clara added with a wink. Eric nodded. "Very few people have it. But Aunt Clara is Fort Hood's living archive, especially when it comes to personnel matters. Isn't that right, Aunt Clara?" "Unfortunately," she said with a mock sigh. I stared at her, then at Eric, and back to her. "So, you remember everything? Everything that happens to you personally?" "Everything," she said. "The good and the bad. Believe me, it's not all it's cracked up to be." "Wow," I muttered. "That must be intense. How do you even have room for all that?" "No one knows," she said, "but it's always there. And yes, it has its downsides. It can be overwhelming if you let it get to you." "I can only imagine," I replied, still wrapping my head around the idea. Eric interrupted, pulling the conversation back. "Mark here is trying to track someone down. Blonde hair, blue eyes, about the same age as him. Do you remember anyone like that?" Aunt Clara laughed. "That's it? No height? No rank? Not even initials? You're not making this easy, Mark." I shrugged. "No, ma'am." "Stop with the ma'am. It's Aunt Clara," she chided. "Give me a little time to think and ask around. It's important, isn't it?" I nodded. "Yes, it is. I need to know." She smiled sympathetically. "All right, I'll see what I can do. Give me your number, and I'll call you if I dig up anything." 2 days later, Eric got a call from Aunt Clara. She'd been thinking about it and still didn't remember any blonde, blue-eyed officers that fit the profile. But she did know 2 civilians who worked at the Office of Postal Engineers. One had been there for 30 years, so he was likely too old. The other had been there about 10 years and used to head the plumbing department. His name was David Ross. He was now in charge of new construction. There were about 15 other blue-eyed blondes on post, Aunt Clara had told Eric, but the ages don't line up. And I didn't look into any civilians off base since I assumed Major Benson wouldn't have had time to make many civilian friends. When Eric passed on the info, I immediately started planning how I could meet this David Ross. Maybe he was the guy. Maybe I'd finally get the answers I'd been craving. And maybe, just maybe, I'd get a little revenge too. Men who prey on the wives of military personnel are the second lowest scum on earth. The absolute lowest? Those who go after a soldier's wife while he's deployed overseas. Those cowards deserve the worst fate imaginable. The next morning, I parked a street over from David Ross's house, sitting in my rental car. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Maybe for him to head to the golf course or run an errand. I was hoping he'd need something from the hardware store. After sitting there for nearly 2 hours, I saw his car pull out of the garage and speed down the road. Finally, I didn't want to waste my whole day staking him out, but I would have done it if I had to. I followed him to Home Depot, keeping my distance. We both parked, and I trailed him inside. It was clear Ross was a regular there. He greeted a few employees like he knew them. There was a coffee station near the front, the kind they have for contractors. Ross poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, chatting with one of the sales clerks. Watching him stand there, slurping his coffee, I thought about how not only had he slept with my wife and gotten her pregnant, but he also chewed his gum with his mouth open. Disgusting. It was hard to decide which made me angrier. After the clerk left to help another customer, Ross tossed his gum into a paper cup, finished his coffee, and started unwrapping another piece of gum as he walked away. As soon as he was out of sight, I moved quickly. I walked over to the trash can, spotted his cup right on top, and grabbed it. I looked around to make sure no one had noticed, then hurried back to my car. I called Eric. "You're not going to believe this," I told him. He laughed on the other end. "Get back here, quick. I might have something big by the time you arrive." When I got back to Eric, he was bouncing around like a kid with too much energy, waving papers in the air. "You're not going to believe this," he said, grinning like a maniac. "Seriously, sit down." I sat, and he slapped the papers in front of me. "Look at this," he said. I glanced at the names and addresses on the page, still confused. "So?" I asked. "What am I looking at?" "That's your daughter's name and address, Mark. Her name's Emma now. Emma Lawson." I hacked into the adoption agency's records. He paused, then added, "Well, technically my brother did, but that's not important." I couldn't help but laugh. "Eric, that's incredible, but what am I supposed to do with this? Am I supposed to just walk up to her house and introduce myself?" Eric leaned back, chuckling. "I don't know, man. Maybe we can blackmail someone." "Oh yeah, that's brilliant." Headlines will read, "Two Army officers blackmail 6-year-old girl." Sounds great. Eric tossed the papers onto the coffee table, still grinning. "Okay, maybe not. But we cracked their security. That's something." "Yeah, it's something, all right," I said, laughing. But deep down, I didn't know what to do with this information. The next weekend, I found myself driving 200 miles to Corsicana, where Emma lived with her adoptive family. I don't know why I went. Maybe I just needed to see her, to make this whole mess real in some way. When I got to the neighborhood, I parked on the street, watching the typical suburban scene unfold. Lawnmowers humming, kids playing, neighbors chatting. Nothing out of the ordinary. I waited almost an hour before I saw movement at Emma's house. A car pulled into the driveway, with a man driving, a woman in the passenger seat, and a little girl in the back. The woman got out, walked around to the back seat, and lifted the child out. I could tell it was Emma right away. As the woman straightened her dress, I snapped a few quick pictures from my car. Just then, I heard a noise beside me. A woman and her child were walking by, and the child squealed, "Emma!" The two little girls ran toward each other, giggling and playing right there in front of me. I managed to get a few more pictures before I decided it was time to leave. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I started the car and drove off, heart racing. I pulled over a few blocks away to check the photos. 4 of them came out perfectly. I could even see her blue eyes in one of them. She looked so much like her biological father, Ross. I headed back to Fort Hood the next week, still not sure what to do with this newfound knowledge. Eric and I breezed through the rest of our course. We graduated that Friday and grabbed dinner and drinks to celebrate. The next day, we flew back to our respective homes, Eric to Alaska and me to Seattle. The following Monday, I took Rachel and Grace's DNA results to the testing center. The lab tech, Diane, didn't remember me at first, but when I mentioned the pacifier, it jogged her memory. I handed her the results and the coffee cup with Ross's gum. "See you in 3 weeks, I said as I left. But this time, it didn't even take 3 weeks. Diane called 2 weeks later with the results. "It's a match," she said. "Mother, father, and child. No doubt about it. I'll send you the official results in the mail." So now I had everything. I had proof Ross was the man Rachel cheated with, and that Emma, Grace, was his daughter. But what now? What was I supposed to do with all this information? Confront Ross? Tell Rachel? What good would that do? I found myself at Walmart that day, buying envelopes and paper. I made copies of the DNA reports and a couple of the photos I'd taken of Emma. I wasn't sure what my next step would be, but I knew I wasn't done with this yet. Rachel and Grace. That's what I had now. DNA reports confirming everything I suspected. But before I sent them, I made sure to be careful. I cut off anything on the reports that could indicate where they came from, and I put it all in an envelope. Gloves on the entire time, making sure there were no traces left behind. I used self-adhesive stamps, and instead of licking the envelope, I sealed it with a little water. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. I addressed it to Mrs. David Ross at their home in Killeen, Texas, but I also included Rachel's name and her parents' address in case it needed a backup. Then I drove down to Seattle's main post office and dropped the envelope into the mailbox. I had no idea what would happen when that letter arrived at the Ross house. But a little over a month later, I got a call from Aunt Clara. "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer," she said, her voice sharper than usual. "I'll do my best," I replied, wondering what this was about. "No, you need to do better than that. I need the whole truth. Did you and Eric set Ross up so his wife would file for divorce?" "Aunt Clara, I don't want to sound like I'm being smart, but what are you talking about? What did we do to him?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about. His wife received a mysterious package with DNA results, and now she's blowing up their marriage. What did you do?" All right, I'll tell you. But it wasn't Eric. I did it alone. I laid it out for her, almost all of it, leaving Eric out of the picture. She sighed. "Well, Mark, you've certainly stirred the pot. After she got your package, she didn't know whose DNA was whose. So, she went behind his back, got a sample from him, and sent it for testing along with the profiles of Rachel and the child. Turns out, they were a match." I sat there, silent. "And now?" "Ross has been ranting and raving all over the base. His marriage is falling apart." "Good," I muttered, almost to myself. "That's the best news I've heard in a long time." "Maybe for you," she replied, her voice heavy, "but I feel for his family." After I hung up, I knew it was really over. Rachel and I had been divorced for months, and now Ross was heading down the same road. I folded up all the papers Eric had hacked for me and stored them away in a box of things I didn't need but kept around anyway. My life was moving forward, even if I wasn't exactly sure where it was headed. Over the next few months, I went on a couple of dates, but nothing serious. Then, 2 years later, I found myself back at Fort Hood. I had been expecting an overseas posting like most of my classmates, but somehow, I ended up back where everything started. I stopped by Aunt Clara's office to check in. "How did you end up back here?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "I have no idea," I said, before hearing a familiar voice behind me. "Yes, you do," Eric Thompson said, grinning as he walked into the room. He had just been promoted to lieutenant colonel. We shook hands and laughed. "I needed an assistant, and I figured you'd be perfect for the job. So, I pulled a few strings." We hadn't seen much of each other since the seminar, but it felt good to be reunited with an old friend. After getting settled, I took 2 weeks off for vacation and focused on one thing: buying a house. Rachel and I had saved up for years, planning to buy one together. But since she never showed up to the divorce proceedings, I ended up with everything. I found a nice house within 3 days, paid most of the down payment up front, and got the bank to finance the rest. It felt like a fresh start. I moved into my new place and got the basics: just a bed, a chair, a big TV, and a lawnmower. The first night, I was sitting there in my nearly empty living room, the big front window wide open with no curtains or drapes. It was dark outside, and I had a beer in one hand and a slice of pepperoni pizza in the other. I'd long since ditched the no-red meat diet Rachel had forced on me. Then the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a woman standing there. She had a warm smile and introduced herself as Megan Lawson, but everyone called her Megan. "Hi, neighbor. We just moved into the area not long ago, and I thought I'd come by to introduce myself. If you ever need anything, just let us know. Is your wife here?" I smiled. "Mark Benson. No wife. Divorced." I saw her frown slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Well, don't worry. I'm sure you're a quiet neighbor. No wild parties, loud or otherwise," I joked. She laughed, and we chatted for a few more minutes before she left. I liked her. Friendly, no pretense. The first week in the house flew by, and by Saturday morning, the neighborhood had already decided I needed help. 3 women rang my doorbell, each with food and decorating ideas in hand. They had noticed my empty house at night with the lights on and figured I could use some furniture. Leading the charge was Megan Lawson. By the end of the day, my house had transformed. They'd given me a slightly worn but comfortable leather couch, a dining table and chairs, and a coffee table. It wasn't much, but it made the place feel like a home. As they were getting ready to leave, 3 kids came running into the house, chasing each other. One of the women, Ruth, grabbed 2 of them, while Megan grabbed the third. "Calm down, Emma," Megan said, kneeling beside the little girl. She brushed Emma's blonde hair out of her face and looked up at me. "This is our new neighbor, Major Benson." The girl smiled at me, her blue eyes twinkling. "Hi, I'm Emma." I knelt down to her level. "Hi, Emma. How old are you?" "I'll be 7 soon," she said proudly. I nodded and stood up, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu. Blonde hair, blue eyes. I shook my head to clear it as we all said our goodbyes. As they left, I couldn't help but wonder about the odd coincidence of it all. Moving here, meeting these neighbors, and seeing Emma. Life had taken a strange turn, and part of me wasn't sure what to make of it. As soon as they left, I went straight to the room that was going to be my den. I dug through a box until I found the folder I was looking for. Inside were the pictures I had taken of Grace years ago. It was the same child, Emma. I hadn't thought much about the names of the foster parents before, but now they jumped out at me. The adoption papers clearly listed James and Megan Lawson as Grace's adoptive parents. So Megan, the friendly neighbor who had been so welcoming, had been raising my daughter all along. Megan and her friends helped me get the house together over the next few weeks, and we hosted a neighborhood open house when everything was done. That's when Megan introduced me to her sister-in-law, Laura Young, who was recently divorced. I hadn't had female companionship in what felt like forever, and Laura and I clicked instantly. She was the last to leave the party, and I was eager to call her the next day. We met for lunch and later had dinner with James, Megan, and Emma. Emma was only briefly at the table, though, before she ran off to play with her friends. Over the next few months, Laura and I saw each other as much as possible. Things were progressing well, and the first night we spent together felt like a turning point. We were sitting in my kitchen the next afternoon when the doorbell rang. I tossed on a robe and opened the door to find Megan standing there. "Good afternoon, Mark," she said, strolling into the house without waiting for an invite. She glanced over and saw Laura sitting at the counter, nibbling on a ham and cheese sandwich. Well, what do we have here?" she teased as she approached her sister-in-law. Laura just laughed and set down her sandwich, turning to face Megan. Her robe was open, and Megan reached up to close it, but Laura stopped her, still laughing. "Too late for modesty, sis. He's already seen everything." Megan's eyes widened. "Never mind," she mumbled, and I took the opportunity to slip upstairs and get dressed. By the time I returned, the 2 of them were discussing my bedspread, which quickly fell into silence when they saw me walk back in. The following weekend, James and Megan asked Laura to babysit Emma while they went out for dinner. We were in the backyard watching Emma play in the sandbox when I made a comment that had been on my mind for a while. "She's a beautiful child, isn't she?" I said, not looking directly at Laura. "She really is," Laura agreed. "Did you know she's adopted?" "Really?" I asked, though I already knew. "Yes. They've had her since birth. The adoption agency told them that the birth mother was married but had an affair and got pregnant. The husband was in the military, and she didn't want him to know, so she gave the baby up for adoption. And James and Megan were there to take her home?" "That's right. They changed her name from Grace to Emma, but Grace was the name her birth mother gave her." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. What happened to the birth mother and her husband? No idea. The agency keeps those files sealed up tight. The birth parents can't get information on the adoptive family, and vice versa. As we talked, Emma wandered over and climbed onto Laura's lap. She nestled in and fell asleep almost immediately. Laura smiled and asked me to carry her inside and put her to bed. It was my first time touching her, and I felt a deep discomfort as I picked her up, but I laid her down gently. 7 months later, Laura moved in with me, and a year after that, we got married. Life was good for the first year, calm, happy, until the Army threw a curveball. I was ordered to Germany for a 3-year tour. We took 2 trips back to the States during that time. Once when her father and James's father passed away, and the other for a family reunion. We saw James and Megan both times, but we only saw Emma at the funeral. She was at camp during the reunion. After our tour in Germany, we were reassigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and was assigned as the executive officer at post headquarters, normally a position reserved for a full colonel, but I wasn't about to complain. In the Army, you take what you're given. To get settled, I went through a series of briefings with the various departments at the post. One of the briefings was to be given by the postal engineer. I walked into the conference room, took my seat, and watched as a blue-eyed man with slightly graying blonde hair stood up to begin his presentation. David Ross, he introduced himself. I just stared at him, my mind reeling. He kept talking, but I didn't hear a word of it. All I could think was that this was the man who had shattered my life. He grew more uncomfortable under my gaze, but I didn't stop. When he finished, he asked if anyone had questions. "Tell me, Mr. Ross," I began, my voice calm but deliberate. "Have you ever been to Fort Hood?" "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice steady but his eyes shifting nervously. "I worked in the engineering department. Did you like it there?" "Yes, sir, I did." "So why did you leave?" His eyes flickered with discomfort. "That's personal, sir." "You're right," I said. "I withdraw the question. I just like to know about the people I work with." I paused, then added, "I seem to recall there being a scandal in the Fort Hood engineering department a few years back. Do you know anything about that?" Ross hesitated. "I vaguely remember something about an affair, maybe?" "Ah, well, I just remembered something else," I said, standing up from the table. "Thanks for the briefing. If you ever need anything, you can contact me at headquarters." I pointed to the name tag on my uniform. "In case you forgot, my name is Benson. Mark Benson. Sadler. I wouldn't want you to forget it." I stared straight into his eyes, and I saw the light bulb go off. His face turned red, then pale. He knew exactly who I was. That afternoon, I learned that Mr. David Ross had submitted a request for a transfer. Unfortunately for him, that request had to go through me. When the resignation request landed on my desk the next day, I couldn't help but smile. I scribbled the word "response" in large letters and added a note. "I have plans that involve Mr. Ross's expertise. He will play a key role in the realization of these plans." The following day, to the shock of just about everyone, David Ross submitted his immediate resignation. I signed off on it without a second thought. As the weeks passed, I found myself falling more deeply in love with Laura. Every day, she seemed more beautiful, more vibrant, while I felt myself aging. Middle age creeping up faster than I liked. I often wondered what she saw in me, but whatever it was, I was grateful for it. Time slipped by quickly, and before we knew it, we were stationed in Alaska. One summer, we traveled back to Killeen to visit Megan and James. It was on that trip that they told us Emma, who was nearly 18, wanted to find her biological parents. Emma had known she was adopted her whole life, but now, with her high school graduation coming up, she was eager to know more. James and Megan were supportive, but they had hit a wall with the adoption agency. They wouldn't provide any information due to outdated laws. It was frustrating to them, especially because knowing her birth parents' health history could be crucial for Emma's future. So, they decided to take a different route and used an online DNA and ancestry service, sending in Emma's DNA and waiting for the results. Emma hoped her biological mother could attend her graduation, but with only a few weeks left, it seemed unlikely. That night, Laura and I were already in bed when she turned to me and asked, "What are you going to do about Emma?" "Do about what?" I asked, playing dumb. "Come on, Mark," she said, her voice soft but serious. "We're married. No secrets, remember? I found your little file 6 months after we got married." I sighed. I know, but I figured it was better to keep quiet. I didn't want to upset James and Megan, and it didn't seem important back then. Well, it's important now. You can't keep this to yourself anymore. It's time to tell them everything. I guess you're right. Any advice on how to break the news? Just be honest. They'll take it as well as they can. The next morning, Emma went off to the mall with her best friend, and I gathered everyone else around the kitchen table. I started by telling James and Megan that Laura and I had packed our things upstairs, ready to leave if they wanted to kick us out after hearing what I had to say. They just stared at me, clearly confused. I took a deep breath and told them everything. Emma doesn't need to send off her DNA to find her biological parents, I said. I know who they are. The looks on their faces made it clear I had some serious explaining to do. So I laid it all out, the affair, the adoption, everything. When I finished, I waited, holding my breath. Megan was the first to move. She stood up, walked over to me, and hugged me tightly. Oh, Mark, you've been carrying this all these years. No one should have to live with that kind of weight, she said, her voice thick with emotion. No one deserves that. She hugged me again, and then we both turned to James, who was still sitting there, deep in thought. I'm just trying to wrap my head around the odds of how we all ended up in each other's lives, James said, shaking his head. It's like winning the lottery. So, what do we do now? Megan asked as she sat back down. Laura chimed in, I think Mark should contact his ex-wife and invite her to Emma's graduation. She wants her there, after all. Why me? I protested. Because you're the one who started all this, James said, grinning. But who's going to contact Ross? Not me, I said quickly, and I told them about the last time I had seen David Ross. You never told me that, Laura said, giving me a surprised look. I didn't realize you knew the whole story. I love this woman, I thought as I leaned over and kissed her. Later that day, James and Megan told Emma the truth. She was nervous but excited and eager to meet her biological mother. I knew I had to track down Rachel, so I hired a private investigator. Within 2 hours, he had the phone number for her parents. It took longer to track down Ross. I called Rachel's parents and asked them to pass along my number. It wasn't long before my phone rang. Hello, this is Rachel Bowman. I was given this number. Hi, Rachel. It's Mark. There was a long pause before she responded. Mark? Wow. How are you? I'm good, I replied. But I need to talk to you about something important. What is it? She asked, her curiosity piqued. I can't explain it over the phone. I need to meet with you in person. She hesitated. We haven't spoken in years, and now you want to meet in person for something important? That's a bit suspicious, don't you think? Trust me, Rachel. It's something you'll want to hear in person. After a long pause, she sighed. Fine. We live in Vegas now. You can meet me here. I flew to Las Vegas the next day, and we met in the lobby of the Bellagio Hotel. Rachel had brought her husband, Roland, with her. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of him, she said, her tone icy. Fine, I said. This is about the daughter you gave up. Rachel turned pale. Can we talk? She asked quietly. Roland gave her a reassuring nod. We found a quiet corner, and I ordered a bottle of red wine. After the glasses were poured, I broke the news. Her name is Emma. She's graduating in 2 weeks, and she wants you to be there. Rachel fainted, her wine glass still in hand. Roland caught the glass before it spilled, gently patting her cheeks until she came to. When she regained her senses, I pulled out a picture of Emma and handed it to her. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she touched the photo. She's beautiful, she whispered. Where did you get this? I took it in her living room yesterday, I replied. You took it? She asked, stunned. Why didn't you tell me any of this before? Why did you keep her from me all these years? Her voice grew louder, and Roland stepped in. Calm down, Rachel. You gave up all rights to her when you signed those papers. Mark didn't keep anything from you. He's actually breaking the law by doing this, so let's keep it cool. Rachel calmed down, wiping her tears. When can I see her? At her graduation, if you want, I said. But you'll need to give her time to adjust. How about the day before? She asked, smiling weakly. That works, I agreed. Let me take a picture of you now, so she can see what you look like. After taking the photo, Rachel rushed over and hugged me tightly, kissing my cheek. Roland laughed. Not too shy, is she? I flew back to prepare Emma, showing her the picture of Rachel. She's beautiful, Emma said, her eyes wide with a mix of nerves and excitement. For the first time since I'd known her, she hugged me. Thank you, Uncle Mark. Now we know where you get your beauty, Megan teased, hugging Emma close. Do you know what my birth father looks like? Emma asked timidly. The room went silent, and all eyes turned to me. I took a deep breath. You got your blonde hair and blue eyes from him. The room let out a collective sigh of relief. We had only a week left of vacation, so I returned to Alaska, promising to be back 2 days before the graduation. Before I left, I got a call from the private investigator. He had found out that Ross had taken a consulting job with the Middle Eastern government after leaving his post. Shortly after arriving, he disappeared, just like several other American consultants had. No one had seen him since. When I got back to Colleen, I met Rachel and Roland at the airport and drove them straight to Emma's house. When we arrived, Emma stood in the middle of the living room, nervous but ready. Rachel stepped forward, and the two of them just stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice trembling. "I brought you this," she said, pulling out the pacifier from years ago. "It belonged to you. I thought you might want it back."